And now it's over to our final speaker, who is Geoff.
Okay, excellent. Right, my name's Geoff Cooper. I'm the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust Heritage Programme Manager. I'm a conservation carpenter by trade. I've spent 2 seasons working in the Ross Sea with the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust and 3 years now with the UK Trust. And I'd like to share with you and give you an insight some of the challenges which we have to work with, both off season when we're in the UK as well as on site in Antarctica. As Sophie mentioned, we look after 6 sites, ex-Bass FID sites, and they range over 250 miles or 400 kilometres of the Antarctic Peninsula, and we experience a number of different climates. So we have a very wet climate up at Port Lockroy, the northern sites, whereas down at Stonington, the most southerly of our sites, you can experience what was called the fumigator, which was a katabatic wind which comes off the Northeast Glacier, and you can have winds up to 150 kilometres an hour. So that's a bit of a challenge to be working out in. And we have difficulty of access issues with sea ice. The site at Detai is often iced in, and unfortunately we can't often get to that site. And the further south you go, the less ships are also available to transport us and to come and visit. As I say, we look after 6 sites which cover the period from Tabarin, which is from February 1944 at Port Lockroy in the top left, which is established there to put a British presence on the Antarctic Peninsula. Wordy House, top right, was built in the later part of the 1940s, and Horseshoe Island, Detai, these were examples of prefabricated buildings built by Bolton and Paul, with various extensions added to them during the base's life and as the bases evolved. We have Stonington Island at the bottom, which was the second of the British sites on the island, which was started in 1960s, and the bottom right one is Demoy Hut, which was built in the 1970s. The bases are largely left as they were when the bases were closed, but Port Lockroy was extensively rebuilt by Bass in the 1996 after the surveys to assess the significance of the site. It's important to conserve these sites. I think we've heard this evening about that. It's not just the buildings themselves, but the contained artifacts, as described by Sophie, but also the associated stories of science and exploration for both our current and the future generations. So, like I say, I'd like to share with you some of the challenges that we deal with. And this is some of my off-season work. Historic research is vital in developing a conservation programme for these huts, rather than just running an ad hoc maintenance programme. We must understand how the bases were constructed originally and how they've changed during their operation, and identify when these changes happened. The Bass Archive is the most fantastic resource for this, containing the base diaries, general reports, if we're lucky, construction reports, mechanical reports. They also have an extensive photographic library and also a film archive occasionally for some of the sites, so you can actually get some movie footage of the sites. Absolutely amazing resource. So we have things like the original Tabarin reports. We've got the Tabarin based diaries, the general reports, as I say, and these photographs. And please remember that the floor plan that you see at the top of the photograph, the slides of Wordy House. We'll come back to that later. Sorry. We're also phenomenally lucky to actually have contact with some of the FIDs and people that actually lived in these bases and operated in the bases, as Sophie mentioned earlier, and to capture that knowledge and first-hand accounts of life in the bases, which is an absolutely amazing resource to understand the bases and how they operated these changes. One of the things that I do is establish the lifeline of the building, and by doing so, you can, like I say, we can track these changes. My research in this photograph is from the Bolton and Paul archive, which is in Norwich. And they have photographs of some of the buildings which were built for Bass at the time. And this is the generator shed at Port Lockroy, which some of you may know as where the shop is. And so this is how the building was originally constructed in the Bolton and Paul's workshop. And this is how they planned for it to be constructed. Through contact with David Price, one of the FIDs who was stationed at Port Lockroy, he actually built the generator shed. So he took the panels, which were shipped down from the UK, and he then turned them into the building that we see today. And we have a construction report, luckily for that, and extensive photographic evidence of how the building was actually built, which isn't necessarily always as the building was intended to be built. And that the building walls ended up being slightly longer on one side than the other and had to be adapted for various reasons. So we can learn from these photographs, and we can compare them to how the base is today. And again, we can look and track these changes. Another big part of my job, which happens on site as well as here in the UK, is picking apart history. And in some ways, we're doing an historic building crime scene situation. We're actually investigating the buildings, picking them apart, trying to understand how they are. This photograph is at Stonnington Island, and in the foreground we have the British base, and in the background you can just make out over the top of the roof is an American base. So we actually have a complexity of a British site and an American site. And halfway between the two bases, there is what's termed the emergency store. And if you look at the timbers in there, they're stamped with American stamps, so stencils. So it looks like it was an American building, but through research and looking in the archive at BAS, we've established that that building was actually a British building built by salvaging materials from the American base. And so you have to understand the use of the buildings and how they were built, and that's a hybrid really of British use and American materials. If you look in the published records, we have Port Lockroy as originally constructed in the top left-hand corner, and in the bottom right-hand corner we have Wordy House, which was built in 1947. The published account says that the front portion, which is where the now lounge and the ionospherics room is, but was originally the mess room and the bunks rooms, was removed in early 1947 and taken down to build Wordy House. However, if you actually look at the building or the two buildings, the materials don't actually match at all. The windows are different, the actual materials used to construct the bases are actually different. And so something didn't quite add up here. So I continued doing more research, and unfortunately, I think I managed to find the one diary which doesn't exist in the BAS archive, which was the early Wordy House based diary. So we didn't have the information from that. But through researching Stonnington, I found this photograph at the bottom, which is the one and only photograph of the construction of Wordy House. And the actual main base is the part that's being constructed in the foreground where the men are, and you can see there's a building in the background. And it's like, so what's that building? Through contact with the BAS Club, I found this gentleman whose name is Gordon Stock, and he was one of the three who originally built Wordy House. And so don't necessarily believe what you read, but certainly believe what you hear. So Gordon came in to visit us, and we looked through the archive, we looked at the old photographs, and he informed me that no, that the Wordy House was not constructed from the front of Port Lockroy. Certain components were, like the flagpole, and we'll come back to look at the flagpole that you can see in both photographs, but the building itself was actually salvaged from Deception Island and brought down and constructed then. But that building we can see in the bottom photograph was the generator shed, and that was the first part that was built. Gordon was one of the first three that was there, and he told me of living in the packing crate that the engine that came down to Wordy House was, that powered the radio sets, and he actually lived in the packing case for a month while they built the house, then had somewhere to live. He also told me stories about being saved from a crevasse fall by one of the dogs that he trained. And so you can see preserving these stories and is as important, if not more so, than the actual buildings and the artifacts themselves. And so talking to people like Gordon, it makes you realize that a heroic era actually continued through to into the Operation Tabarin and into the FIDS era. All these activities that they did were quite heroic in their own right. Also, you can often believe what you can see. So on the right-hand side, we have two pictures of the same part of a building. The top one's from 1952, and the bottom is from this last season in early 2020. And you can see that the building's largely changed, but through having the historic photographs, you can actually walk around the building and look for the witness marks of where the screws were for these shelves and for the speaker that's on the wall, and you can still find them and you can still see them. So you can make the direct link between what you can observe now and the historic photographs and actually date when changes happened. On the left-hand side, this is looking up inside the roof of Port Lockroy, and roofs are always the most fantastic place to go and pick apart a building and understand them. And you can see on the left-hand side, the original Bolton and Paul part of Bransfield House. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the original extension, which they built again from Deception salvage timbers with a canvas roof, which is always recorded in the diaries as often leaking. And you can still actually see evidence of all these components within the building. So it's very important to look around and read the buildings and learn about every single stage of the construction. And if you look hard enough, you can find all these different stages. However, sometimes you can't always believe what you read or see. So you do need to marry up the history from the Bass Archive and the written accounts and from the observed accounts from talking to the men. So the top left-hand photograph is the radio room in Port Lockroy. And it looks very similar to the radio room now. But if you actually look in more detail, and you can see the photographs from 1944, this is the original radio room, which is now actually half in the larder. And you can still see, again, the witness marks, the screw holes for the speaker at the top, and the little electrical mounting points around the wall. So again, a keen observation and looking for the knots in the timbers and the screw holes, you can actually identify where things were and how the buildings had changed and things have moved. Things like the toilet at Port Lockroy has had changes through the Bass restoration and conservation work they did in the 1990s through to the current day. And I mentioned that the Wordy House flag, the flag was always on the back of the generator shed. So the flagpole you see there isn't where the original flag was. That's actually was a wind generator. So that gave them lights in the building. So again, you have to not take for granted everything you see. You need to do that forensic analysis of the building and marry up what you see with the history, both written and verbal, and capturing that first-hand experience from the FIDS and the Bass personnel that lived and worked in these huts is the most critical thing at the moment. So that's some of the components of my UK work. I'd like to now come on to some of the field logistics. So this is the flip side of the coin. As I say, we look after these 6 sites, many of them in remote locations. And we have a challenge of getting the staff there, the food there, the camp itself, and building materials and all the rest of it, and transporting it. We have fantastic support from IARTO and the ARTO fleet and from the Royal Navy. And you can see HMS Protector at the top there, that they've helped us to move the very large amount of materials we often take to site, something like up to 6 tons. We have a single opportunity to do this each year, so there's a lot of planning goes into all this to make sure that we have everything we need for all the planned tasks that we need to do. And we can't nip to the hardware shop, as was mentioned earlier. So it's so critical to evaluate what tasks you're going to be doing and take everything with you. And as you can see at the bottom, some things haven't changed into the modern era. Moving materials around on site is almost identical, but one's almost a colorized version of the original photograph. So it still comes down to moving things around by hand. Actually working and living down in Antarctica, when we're up at sites like Port Lockroy, we're lucky in that we have the Nissen hut to live in. Some of you may have seen that. And that is comparative luxury compared to many of the other sites. Working at Wordy House, we're very lucky that the Ukrainian base Bernadsky is on what used to be the Faraday site, which is on the neighbouring island. And we have had fantastic support from them this last season in surveying the site there. However, when we look to the southern sites, so Detai, Horseshoe and Stonnington, we are in the realm of field camps. And so we are living and working on the islands and always in tented accommodation. We don't stay in the historic buildings themselves at all. We respect them and we live in camps. And the camps bring their own challenges. As I say, transport is a big challenge to these southern sites. You get a lot less ships come down to the southern area and to the Marguerite Bay. And so getting materials, we infrequently see people, and we are largely reliant on those ships for giving us things like washing facilities. And so at some of the sites, we can often be out in the field for several weeks between the opportunity of having a wash. Accommodation is a bit more basic. So we have in the bottom left-hand corner a communal tent, which we use for our cooking and our communications area, and we eat in there. So we have a communal area. And we have sleeping tents, an individual sleeping tent, which is your living space. And so that's where you can get away from everybody else. Otherwise, you're largely living out of each other's pockets. At the bottom, you can see Michael, that there he's digging out Port Lockroy, and you can just see the top of the window. So we're out in days that are very cold, wet, windy, snowy, digging away the buildings, working very long hours in these difficult conditions. And at the end of the day, you're going back to a tent. To do the carpentry, we don't have the luxury of having a workshop to work in. And you can see at the top that we lay out tarpaulins to capture all of our sawdust, and we have the materials stored outside, and we work outside. So we're very weather dependent in our work programs. As I say, we're a very small team, often 4 or 5 people working long periods together. And so the selection of the team is critical. It's important to not have people that will just survive under these conditions. It's important to have people that will actually thrive under these conditions and enjoy the conditions and the work. So why are we actually there? What do we do when we're on site? A large component of what we do is surveying. So we're actually looking at the buildings and gathering data for the writing of the conservation management plans and the implementation plans. And in doing so, we're often looking at the condition of the building, looking for what's wrong, what needs repairing. And so then through historical research, we can see how was it built originally, what materials were used, what types of nails and screws were used. So we actually take samples and we look and we see what type of nails and screws we used. And we'll use the same type. You would not use modern screws when we do the actual conservation repairs. Occasionally we find components that are missing, like at the top left, we have refrigerator style door handles that we used at Stonington, which were actually borrowed from the American site and used on the British site. We look at hold downs that were there at Stonington, and where you can see it's all corroded away. So we're looking for what components were there originally, so that when we go back and do the conservation works, we can put in something that looks historically correct, but maybe have small upgrades to meet the modern requirements for structural engineers. So we're sampling the materials, we're sampling the fixings, we take small paint samples from the building as well, so that if we do need to do any form of redecoration on certain things like windows and doors to preserve them, we could paint them to certain eras, so because we know what exactly the paint was at that time. And that whole process will then feed into the procurement process and then the shipping. So it's a cyclical pattern. And I'd like to include some data that we captured this season by the BAS Magic team, their mapping team and survey team. They came with us and they used some 3D terrestrial laser scanning and captured these images of Wordy House. And you can see the level of detail that we managed to capture in their buildings is absolutely stunning. And we can use this data and refer back to historic reports. And you can remember earlier on in the talk, I mentioned the floor plan for Wordy House. So we can actually match the bottom left image, which is the floor plan as now, and we can then look how that related to the floor plan as originally used. This is from 1960 when the base T team overwintered there. These scans collect the most amazing amount of data, which we can use with the architects and other professionals who can't come with us always down to Antarctica, but we can bring the building back to them basically, and we can then interact with them and turn the building around on the computer, look at it in different ways. We can use it for public engagement, and the models are so much better than photographs. So many times you want to look at a feature and it's always just on the edge of a single photograph. On the models you can actually turn it around and look at those components. So the most amazing thing, and I say we can true the original floor plans to what we can see now. Another component of what we do is emergency repairs, because what we're trying to do is keep the building structurally sound and weather tight until we can actually come back and do the true conservation repairs, which we'll do after we've written the conservation management plans, created the implementation plan, and raised the funds to actually do this work, all activities that we're currently on for the sites. So we have a number of planned tasks that we will be doing. So you can see this is actually the emergency store, the building I mentioned between the American site and the British site on Stonington Island. Various panels were missing off the building and the building was full of ice. So we actually managed to find the panels that were missing, put them back into position, and then refelted over the building. So now that building is weather tight and it's structurally sound. We also do other components like repairing windows and doors. Sometimes there's broken glass there, so we'll fix those windows, we'll make sure the doors work, the hinges work, so we can shut them, keep the ice and snow out. We also get involved in more complex tasks, which require some specialist training, things like asbestos mitigation, which you can see on the right-hand side. So potentially the flues contain asbestos, and we encapsulate them so that we're not causing any more environmental damage, and stabilising them while we plan what we're going to be doing. You can see on the left-hand side, the flues potentially are leaning away from the building. The perspective of the photograph looks very confusing. The scaffold tower is actually upright. It's the flue that's leaning. And so we actually tied that back to the building with stabilizing guys. We found a lot of ice had got into the pup pens, which are on the right-hand side. So we removed all that ice carefully. And within that, we actually found the doors, which were off. All the individual pup pens were actually encapsulated within the ice. So carefully removing all the ice, we've now got the doors back and we'll reinstate them where they originally were. We also get involved in some tasks which are a bit more spur of the moment, shall we say. So the middle photograph at the top is we found that part of the wall of East Base was falling over and coming out from underneath the roof. So we had to devise a way of stabilizing the building to stop it falling apart, using the materials that we have to hand. So again, it's quite critical to recruit staff that have experience and they're capable of thinking on their feet and making the best of the materials and items that you have to hand to solve a problem. So it's quite a critical ability of people that we take down, that they can do this problem solving and thinking on their feet. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour. So in conclusion, I would like to say almost exactly 76 years to the day since this photograph was taken of my fellow carpenter. This is Chippy Ashton, who built Port Lockroy. He's standing very proudly in front of his hut, and I'd like to say thank you for your time this evening to listen to some of the challenges that we face in conserving these huts.
Fantastic, thank you so much.